is just an instance of a class. So the class is like an overall template. It defines what a student is, but an object is an actual student with actual information. So we could call student one now, this is a student object. So I just want to show you guys what this student object actually is and what we can do with it. And then I'm going to talk some more about that init function from before. So over here, I'm just going to make a print statement. And inside of here, I just want to print out student. And what's cool about this student one object is I can actually access each of the attributes from inside of this object. So if I wanted to get the name of the student, I could say student1.name. And now this is actually going to print out the student's name. So over here, you'll see it prints out Jim. If I wanted, I could print out the student's GPA, and it's going to print out the student's GPA, 3.1. So now that I created this student object, I can actually access the information about the student. So essentially, I've just created a student data type. So I could create as many of these students as I wanted. If I wanted, I could create another student. We could call it student2. And essentially, we do the same thing. We just give it different information. So we could say like Pam, and her major is art, and she has like a 2.5, and let's say that she is on probation. So now I have another student, student2. So if I wanted, I could access information about that student. We could say like student2.gpa. And now this is giving me the GPA of student2. So basically what I did was I created a student data type and I created student objects, and now I'm able to represent a student inside of my program. So let's talk real quick about all this stuff over here because I didn't really explain it. Basically what's happening is when I come over here and I say student and I'm passing in all of these different values, those are getting passed into this init function. So remember, I passed in a name, I passed in a major, I passed in a GPA. When we create that student, we're actually calling this function. And when I pass in the name, the major, and the GPA, those values are actually getting stored over here in this name, this major, this GPA, etc. Right? So I'm giving this student object all of that information. And down here, what I'm doing is I'm saying self.name is equal to name. And basically what this means is the actual object's name is going to be equal to the name that they passed in. So self.name is an attribute of student, right? So the student is storing a name, the student is storing a major, the student is storing a GPA. But that's different from this name, this major, and this GPA. Remember, these are all just values that I passed in. They're just parameters. And so I need to take the values that I passed in and I need to assign them to the actual attributes of the object. So I need to say, okay, the name of the student is going to be equal to the name that we passed in. One more time. The name of the student object is going to be equal to the name that we passed in. The name of the student's major is going to be equal to the major that we passed in. The student's GPA is going to be equal to the GPA that we passed in. That's basically what's happening here. So when I say self, it's referring to the actual object. So over here, when I'm creating this student object, I'm giving it all of this information. It's taking that information and storing it as attributes for the object. So hopefully that makes sense. I think that's about as clear as I can make it. But the point is that now we have a student data type. So now I can represent a student inside of my Python program. And that's like super powerful. And what's cool about classes and objects is you can do this with anything. So in this example, we created a student class and then we created student objects off of that. But I can model any real world entity into this program. I could model something like a phone, or I could model like a water bottle, or I could model, a keyboard, right? I could model anything that I wanted inside of my program. I could just give it certain attributes, right? And so that's what's cool about classes is we can model real world objects and we can create our own data types. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you guys how to build a multiple choice quiz in Python. So basically, we're going to set up a little multiple choice quiz and we'll have the user take the quiz, and as they take the quiz, We'll keep track of their score, and then at the end, we'll tell them how they did. So this is gonna be a pretty cool video. I'm excited to show you guys how to do this, and we'll get to use things like classes and if statements and loops in order to build this program. So we're gonna use a lot of cool stuff in Python. The first thing I wanna show you guys, I actually did this before I started the video. It's this little array, it's called question prompts. And I basically just wrote out all the questions that are gonna be, or I shouldn't say the questions, I wrote out all the question prompts that are gonna be inside of my multiple choice quiz. So the first one just says, what color are apples? And the answers are red, purple, or orange. The next one is, what color are bananas? The options are teal, magenta, and yellow. And the third question is, what color are strawberries? And the options are yellow, red, and blue. So this is obviously a very, very easy multiple choice quiz, but I just kind of wrote out the questions beforehand so I didn't have to spend time doing that. So let's talk about how we can build a multiple choice test. Well, the first thing I want to think about is, how can I represent the questions in the test, right? Over here we have the question prompts, but there's actually two parts to a question when you think about it. There's the prompt, in other words, like the actual question itself, and then there's the answer to the question. And both of those attributes need to be kept track of, right? I need to keep track of what we want to ask, and I need to keep track of what the answer is. So what I'm actually going to do is create a question class. So I'm going to create a little data type for questions, and inside of that question class, we'll be able to store the question prompt, and we'll also be able to store the question's answer. So I'm just gonna come over here to my folder, and I'm gonna make a new Python file, and we're just gonna call this question.py. So we'll call it question.py. And inside of this question.py file, I'm gonna make a class. So I'm just gonna say class question, and I'm gonna put a colon here. So inside of this question class, we wanna define it in an initialize function. So I'm gonna say def 2 underscores init 2 underscores, and then we're gonna type out an open and close parentheses, self, and then a colon. So after this self, we wanna define the different attributes that will describe or that will be included in a question. So we're gonna include a prompt, and we're gonna include an answer. So every question will have a question prompt and a question answer. And now down here, I want to take those values and assign them to the actual class object. So I'm going to say self.prompt is equal to prompt, and I'm going to say self.answer is equal to answer. So now we have a question class set up, and we can store all the information we need about a question. So what I want to do now is go back over to my app.python file, and we're actually going to create an array of questions. So I have over here these 3 prompts, and I'm actually just going to create another array. So we'll just call it questions, and I'm just going to set it equal to 2 open and close square brackets, and we're going to start creating question objects. So I can just say the first element in this questions array will be a question, and we want to pass question prompts 0, and the answer to the first question was A, red, green. That's the color of apple. So I'm going to pass that first question, and I'm also going to pass the answer, which is A. And you'll see down here I'm getting an error, so it's saying unresolved reference question. So actually what we need to do before we can create these questions is we need to import this question class. So I'm going to come up here and say from question import question. And so now down here in this questions array, we're not getting that error anymore. So we created one question object, and I'm just gonna create a couple more for these other ones. So I'm just gonna copy this one, and we will paste this down here. All right, so now we're creating 2 other questions, and these ones are gonna be 1 and 2. And the answer to the second question is C. And the answer to the third question, I think it's B. Let me look. Yeah, so it's C and B. All right, so essentially what we're doing is we're creating 3 questions. Each one is getting a different question prompt, and they're each getting different answers. So now we have an array of questions that we want to ask on our test. So the next step is to actually write a function that will run the test, right? It has to ask the user the questions, and it has to check to see if they got the answer right. So Down here, lower in the file, let's create a function. So I'm just gonna say def, and we'll call this run test. And inside of this parentheses, we're gonna take one parameter into this function. We're gonna take a list of questions. So I'm just gonna say questions. So this is basically gonna be a list of question objects that we wanna ask the user. So once I'm in here, all I wanna do is loop through all the questions. So I wanna loop through each question, I wanna ask it to the user, I wanna get the user's answer, and I wanna check to see if it's right. And we need to be able to keep track of how the user does through the test. So I wanna create a variable called score. And I'm just gonna set it equal to 0. So every time the user answers a question right, we'll increment this score variable. All right, so what I wanna do is, like I said, loop through all the questions in that questions array. So I'm gonna create a for loop. I'm gonna say for question in questions. So in other words, for each question object inside of this questions array, I wanna do something. And basically, the first thing I wanna do is ask the user the question. And I wanna store their response inside of a variable. So I'm gonna make a variable down here called answer. And this is gonna represent the user's answer to the question. And I'm gonna set it equal to input, and I need to give this a prompt. So I'm actually gonna give this the prompt for the question. So I can just say question.prompt. So now I have the answer that the user entered in, which is stored inside this variable. So we wanna check to see if they got the question right. And I can do that using an if statement. So I can say if answer, and this refers to the student's answer, is equal to question.answer. So I'm checking to see if the answer that the student gave is equal to the answer of the current question that we're asking. And if this is true, then I just want to increment score. So I'm gonna say score plus equals 1. And this basically just means we're adding 1 to the score. So the last thing I want to do inside of this function is just print out the result. So I wanna print out how the user did. So down here, I'm just gonna say print, and I'm basically just gonna print out like, hey, you got like 2 out of 3 questions, or you got 5 out of 6 questions right, or you got 0 out of 10 questions right. We'll just print out how they did. So I'll just say you got, and now I wanna print out how many questions they got right. So this is just gonna be the score. And in order to print a number alongside of a string like this, I'm gonna have to say str and then type in the number. So we'll say str score. So we'll basically say you got however many they got right out of, so we'll use this little /, and now we'll just say how many questions there were. So we can say, and again, we're gonna have to convert this to a string because it's gonna be a number. So we can say string, and then we wanna figure out how many questions were in that questions array. So I can say len, and inside of here, we can just say questions. So this is kind of like this long statement just to print out how many questions there were. So then over here, I'll just say correct. All right, so now we have this print statement, and it's just gonna be printing out how many questions they got right. So let's see if this works. The last thing I need to do is just call this run test function. So I'll say run test, and I'm just gonna pass it that questions array that we created before. So we created this questions array with all of these question objects inside of it. I'm basically just gonna pass that into this run test function. So now let's run our program and see how we did. Hopefully we don't get any errors. There's a lot of code there, so it's possible that we might. Okay, so it says, what color are apples? This is a tough one. All right, let's put A, so we'll get the first question right. What color are bananas? Let's get the second question wrong. So I'm gonna say B, bananas are magenta. And we'll get the third question right. So it says, what color are strawberries? I'll just put B because that's the right answer. So now you'll see that our program prints out, you got 2 out of 3 correct. So not only did it ask us all the questions and get our input for each question, but it also kept track of our score and it printed it out. So why don't we run through the test one more time, and we'll just like get 2 wrong this time. So I'll get this one wrong, I'll get this one wrong, and I'll get this one right. So now it says you got 1 out of 3 correct. So it's able to actually grade our test. And what's cool about the program we just wrote is if I wanted, I could add another question into here and it would automatically be able to ask it. So it doesn't matter how many questions we put in here, it's just able to ask it. And so really the point I was trying to make with this whole video was just how we can use something like a class in order to model a real world entity. So for example, we created this question class and we were able to store all the information about a question that we could ever need. So we were able to store like the prompt and the answer. So we created our own question data type, and then we were able to create a bunch of different questions, pass it into this run test method, and it was able to grade the test and just run the test really easily. So that's kind of the point. So hopefully this makes sense. You know, this was a lot of code, so if you don't fully understand what I did, go back, watch the video, you know, try it a couple times on your own and see if you can create your own multiple choice test. In this tutorial, I want to talk to you guys about class functions in Python. So a class function is essentially a function that we can use inside of a class, and it can either modify the objects of that class or it can give us specific information about those objects. Over here, I have this student.py file. And inside of here, I created a student class. So I just had a class student, and I gave this student a couple of different attributes. I gave it a name, a major, and a GPA. So I can give this student all of this information. So when I create a student object, it'll have all of that information in it. Now over here on this app.py file, I actually created two students. So student one is Oscar, who's studying accounting, and he has a GPA of 3.1. Student two is Phyllis, who's studying business, and she has a 3.8. So what we can actually do is we can use functions inside of these class files. So I could actually define a function inside of this student class, and then all of my student objects could access it. So for example, I could come down here and create a function, and let's say we wanted to create a function that told us whether or not this particular student had honors. So whether or not they were on the honor roll, right? Basically, like, are they like a really good student? So I could define a function called on honor roll, and basically what it's going to do, it's going to tell me whether or not this particular student is on the honor roll. And let's basically just say the rules for being on honor roll is you have to have a GPA of 3.5 or above. So if your GPA is 3.5 or above, that means you're on the honor roll. Well, over here, I could actually write the code for that. So I could say if self.gpa, and when I say self over here, this is referring to like the actual student's GPA. And you'll notice over here I have to pass that in as a parameter, and that always has to be the first parameter. So I could say if self.gpa is greater than or equal to 3.5, then we can return true, because this student is on the honor roll. Otherwise, else we can just return false, because if their GPA isn't above a 3.5, then they're not on the honor roll. So that's essentially our little on honor roll function. And you can see it's a very small function, but it provides a service to the objects of this class, right? It allows the objects of this class to figure out whether or not that current student is on the honor roll. So over in this app.py file, I could just print out that value. So I could say print, and I'm going to see if student one is on the honor roll. So now when I run this, you'll see it should print out false. And it's printing out false down here because student one only has a GPA of 3.1. If I was to do the same thing on student two has a GPA of 3.8, so we should return true. And that's exactly what happens. So essentially a class function is just a little function that can be used by the objects of the class. And I would say this is a pretty good example of like what a class function should be doing. It should be like giving us information about the class, or it could also be like modifying information about the class. And so that's the basics of using functions in classes. I mean, this is a pretty simple tutorial, but I really just wanted to introduce you guys to the concept of putting functions inside of classes. This is going to be really useful, and if you're making a class, you always want to think about like what functions can I put inside of here that will, you know, essentially help the user to either figure out information about the object or modify different values in the object. In this tutorial, I want to talk to you guys about inheritance in Python. Now, inheritance is basically where we can define a bunch of attributes and functions and things inside of a class, and then we can create another class and we can inherit all of those attributes. So I could basically have one class that has all the functionality of another class without having to physically write out any of the same methods or attributes. So if that's confusing, don't worry. I'm gonna show you guys exactly what this is in this video. So let me show you about some stuff I have set up over here. I created this class called Chef. And over here we just have this class Chef. And inside of this Chef class, we have 3 functions. So this Chef can do 3 things. The Chef can make chicken, the Chef can make salad, and the Chef can make a special dish. And whenever the Chef makes a dish, he basically just says, the Chef makes a chicken, or the Chef makes a salad, or the Chef makes barbecue ribs for this special dish. It's basically just saying whatever the Chef is doing. So if I was to come over here to my app.python file, you'll notice that I'm importing the Chef. So I'm basically allowed to use this Chef class now. And I can say my Chef is equal to Chef. So I'm creating a new Chef. So now if I came down here and I said my Chef dot make chicken, when I run my program, now it's gonna say the Chef makes a chicken. If I said make special dish and I run the program, now it's gonna say the Chef makes barbecue ribs, right? Because that's the Chef's special dish. So I have this really awesome Chef class and it works really well. But let's say that I wanted to create another class to model another type of chef. Right, so this Chef class is just modeling like some generic chef, right? We're representing some generic chef in our program. But let's say that I wanted to create a class that modeled a different type of chef. For example, let's say we wanted to create a class that modeled a Chinese chef. So instead of just a normal chef, this is a Chinese chef. Well, I actually created a file over here called ChineseChef.python. So we could actually use this ChineseChef.python file to create our Chinese chef class. So I'm just gonna say class, and over here I'm just gonna say Chinese chef, and basically I just can define everything that the Chinese chef can do. But let's say that our Chinese chef can do everything that our generic chef can do. So the Chinese chef is like a special chef, right? It's a very specific type of chef. But let's say that this Chinese chef can do everything that the normal chef can do. So the Chinese chef can make chicken, can make salad, and can also make a special dish. Well, if I wanted to give this Chinese chef all of that functionality, I could just come over here and I could copy all of these functions and I could paste them in here. And so now the Chinese chef can do everything that the other chef can do. But let's say that in addition to all of these things, the Chinese chef can also make a special dish called fried rice. So I could say def, and we could say make fried rice. So the Chinese chef has this extra function which allows it to make fried rice. And over here we could just say the chef makes fried rice. And let's also say that the Chinese chef has a different special dish. So instead of making barbecue ribs, the Chinese chef makes orange chicken. All right, so now we have our Chinese chef class set up, and you'll notice that it can do everything that the normal chef could do. So let's go back over to our app.python file, and I want to create a Chinese chef object. So instead of importing from chef, we're gonna just import from Chinese chef. So I'll say Chinese chef, and we're gonna import Chinese chef. So let's go ahead and make a Chinese chef object. So down here, I'm gonna make one, and I'll just say and then my Chinese chef, we can print out this special dish. So remember, the Chinese chef can do everything that the normal chef could do. So if I say my Chinese chef dot make special dish, when I run this program, you'll see the regular chef is making barbecue ribs and the Chinese chef is making orange chicken. So everything works out. And this Chinese chef also has an extra method called make fried rice, and you can also make fried rice. But here's the problem, right? When I go over here to this ChineseChef.py, when I wanted to use all of the functionality that was inside this chef class, I actually had to copy and physically paste all of these functions down into this file, right? And that's kind of a drag. I mean, especially like, imagine if this chef had like 20 or 30 of these different functions in it. Well, I'd have to copy and I'd have to paste all of those inside of this Chinese chef. And this is where we can use something called inheritance. So instead of having to copy and paste all of these functions, I could just inherit these functions from that chef class. And in order to do that, I can actually just get rid of all of these, and I can come over here and right next to where I'm saying class Chinese chef, inside of parentheses, I can say the name of the class that I want to inherit from. So I could just say chef. And I'm also gonna have to import this. So I'm gonna come over here and we'll say from chef, import chef. So basically what this is saying is inside of this Chinese chef, I wanna be able to use all of the functions that are contained inside of the chef class. So I'll say that one more time. Inside of this Chinese chef class, I wanna be able to use all of the functions that are inside of this chef class. So by using inheritance here, I'm actually able to come over here to this app.py file, and now I'm still able to execute, for example, like the make chicken function. Even though I didn't specify the make chicken function in here, I didn't write it out, I can still run this program and the Chinese chef will still be able to make chicken. So when I run this program, you'll see down here it says the chef makes chicken. And that's because I inherited the make chicken method from the chef class. But here's one thing that got messed up. If I come over here and I say make special dish, remember the Chinese chef special dish was supposed to be orange chicken, but now the Chinese chef is gonna be making barbecue ribs because I inherited this make special dish function from this chef class. And so what I can actually do is I could come in here and I could override that make special dish class. So I could say def make special dish, and down here I can just override it. So I could say the chef makes orange chicken. And now when I go over here and I run this make special dish function, now the chef's gonna be back to making orange chicken. So the Chinese chef will make his special dish. So that's basically what inheritance does. It allows me to inherit functionality from an existing class into the new class. And I can actually just inherit all of it without having to write it out. So I didn't have to write out make chicken and make salad inside the Chinese class, but the Chinese chef can still make chicken and salad because it inherited that functionality from the chef class. In this tutorial, I want to talk to you guys about the Python interpreter. The Python interpreter is basically a little environment that we can use to execute Python commands. So it's kind of like this little sandbox environment where we can test out and try out different Python commands or different Python functions in a very safe and neutral environment. So it's kind of like a quick and dirty way to write Python and try different things out. And the way we use the Python interpreter is by opening up our command prompt. Now, if you're on Windows, there's a program called Command Prompt. If you're on Mac, there's a program called Terminal. And basically you need to open that program in order to use the Python interpreter. So I'm here on a Mac, but if you're on a Windows, you can essentially do exactly what I'm doing just inside of the command prompt. So on Mac here, I'm just gonna search for my terminal. If you're on Windows, you can just search for like CMD or command prompt and it should pop up. So the terminal is basically an environment on our computer where we can interact with the computer and do different things without a graphical user interface. So normally when we interact with the computer, we're using things like buttons or windows, and we can move stuff around. We can basically just like interact with the computer with graphics. But the terminal or the command prompt is a place where we can interact with the computer using text commands. So I'm not going to get too much into what the terminal and the command prompt are, but that's essentially what it is. So inside of here, we can use the Python interpreter. And the Python interpreter is basically just a little program that, like I said, we can write, sort of Python in. So generally, all you have to do is go over to your terminal or your command prompt and type in Python 3. And since we're using Python 3, I'm going to type Python 3. But you can also just type normal Python, and I'm pretty sure that gives you Python 2. Now, here's a quick disclaimer. On Windows, you may run into a problem where you can't use this Python 3 command. And it's possible that if you're running into that problem, Python 3 hasn't been added to your Windows path variable. And basically what that means is your computer doesn't recognize the command Python 3. If that's the case, all you have to do is just go and Google how to add Python 3 to your Windows path variable. It's really easy. I'm not going to get into it in this video just because it's kind of outside the scope, but if you're running into that problem, that's probably it. It's not on your Windows path variable. So just Google around for that and you should be able to find an answer. But I'm going to type Python 3 and I'm going to click enter, and it's going to open up this cool little thing down here. So you can see it basically just says like, here's the version of Python. Now, I'm just gonna enter so we can have some like new lines here. But down here, this is the Python interpreter. So we can write Python code in here and it's gonna work. So I could, for example, I could write like print, and inside of here I could print like hello world. And when I click enter, you'll see that it prints out hello world. I could create a variable. So for example, I could say like num1 is equal to 10. I could say num2 is equal to 90. And then I could print out num1 plus num2, and it's gonna be able to do that for me. I could also use something like a function. So I could define a function in here. We could make a function that's called say hi, and it'll take a name parameter. And you'll see here, when it saw I wanted to create a function, it put these 3 little dots, and I can indent in and we can write the code for our function. So I could say like print hello plus name. And now I have a function called say hi. So I can break out of this by just entering again. And I can call the function. So I could say hi, and we'll say hi to me. Hi, Mike. So now it's gonna say, hello, Mike. So I can use a function. I could use something like an if statement, you know. I could say, I could use something like a for loop. We could use while loops. I mean, we can basically use all of the basic like Python commands and, you know, inside of this Python interpreter. And like I said before, it's essentially just an environment where you can test out Python code. Now, this is not a place where you want to write like any serious Python scripts. So if you're like designing and writing a Python program, I would not recommend doing it inside of this interpreter. It's not a very intuitive environment. It's pretty much just set up for some quick and dirty tests. Like if you need to test something out, great. This is a perfect place for it because you don't have to set up a file. You don't have to use like some IDE. You don't have to execute a file. You just go in here, it's quick, it's dirty, you get it done. But if you're writing like an actual program, you definitely want to use a text editor. The text editor, it's just going to be way more organized. Everything's going to be a lot clearer, and you're not going to get confused with like where stuff is and what you have. So that's the basics of the Python interpreter. You know, in the course, I haven't really been using it at all, just because I think it's a lot easier to teach when we're inside of a file than inside of here. But, you know, don't count this guy out. The Python interpreter is awesome. A lot of people use it, and it's great if you just need to test, you know, little bits of code out without having to set up some huge environment. So Python interpreter, definitely awesome. I would play around with it, you know, have some fun and take advantage of it. Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe to Draft Academy to be the first to know when we release new content. Also, we're always looking to improve, so if you have any constructive criticism or questions or anything, leave a comment below. Finally, if you're enjoying Draft Academy and you want to help us grow, head over to draftacademy.com/contribute and invest in our future.